Okay, over to you.
Yeah. Hello, good morning. My name is Eva Smit. Also, hello, I guess that this is the camera that works. Hello, everybody online. Oh,
I think we're just streaming the presentation at the moment.
Yeah, the sound comes from the laptop, and but they will be seeing.
Oh, you won't be seeing me. That's nothing lost. But anyway, my name is Eva Smit. Very welcome. I'm very happy to see a room so full of people. I work for STM. I'm actually the stand-in here for Julia Wallace, who's the project director, but who had to go quickly back to Scotland because of an emergency. So I'll be doing her presentation. And this is a general introduction, because we have many new faces here in the room. This afternoon we'll be diving much deeper into RA21, but this morning is very much a general introduction. When we were setting up this morning, one of our hosts of JISC, thank you very much, by the way, JISC, for hosting this, asked me, RA21, what kind of abbreviation is that? Well, you know it's resource access for in the 21st century, but the guy here said it sounds like a highway. And I thought, well, maybe it is our highway into the right information and to get there very fast. Because we have created a few problems while making the transition to digital information. You know, when we started in the late 20th century and everybody was still used to the print library in their institute, the electronic version we offered people was very similar to that library. And it meant that whatever you could click on your desktop in the institute would come up in the same way as it would have done in the library, and the machine would recognize your IP address and immediately give you access. But in the 21st century, and that's why it has 21 in the RA abbreviation, people started to work remote and mobile and from the train and from home and from everywhere. And then IP address recognition appeared to have a few shortcomings. And I'll take you very briefly in a bird's eye view through what the real differences are. For example, if you're on campus and you want to look for a certain topic or a certain paper, you do a Google search, you get this list of hits, and you want to click on the first one. This is click number 1, keep counting. That takes you to the ACS website, and you see the abstract here, and you see the article options, and you think, oh, I'd like to have the PDF. Click number 2, and there you are. Easy as everything. Now, in the evening at home, you want to do the same thing. So you type in the same Google search, you get that same list of hits, you hope, because that's not even a certainty. But again, this very article is on top. You click. Click number 1. Takes you to the ACS page. We know that. You see the article options, you think, the PDF. Click number 2. But then. Okay, login, ACS ID password. I don't know if I have that or where did I keep it if I had it. Well, let's try the other one, login via your home institution. Number 3. Aha, okay, now I have to select a region. UK higher education is probably what I have, because I forgot to say I do this as an Oxford University student. Let's try that one. Click number 4. What shall I click here? Maybe University of Oxford. Let's see where that gets me. Click number 5. Oh, new username password. Gosh, did I have that? And where? This is the University of Oxford. Click number 6. Oh, yes, there we are. So, and this is if you had actually remembered username passwords. So you can imagine how frustrating this could be. And that is exactly from where we drafted the RA21 problem statement. We think that in the modern expectations of the consumer web, people expect a lot of other things, and you see them listed here. People want seamless access from any device, any location. They start their searches everywhere, not just in the library catalog. They don't want to have all these pop-up screens that all ask something else, that all have a different user interface. At the same time, at the publisher side, publishers get frustrated by the number of illegal downloads, by leakage, by fraud, by piracy. There's also a lack of user data that could have sparked new user applications and more customized information provision. And then there's privacy and fraud as new issues. So, enough to start a project. And we started it more or less a year ago, when we also invented the name RA21. And we had a first launch meeting where we started to draft guiding principles. And these are sort of the 5 main ones. I won't go through all of them, but they very much reflect the frustrations as listed in the problem statement. So it has to do with seamless access, a very good user interface, a solution that works from many different starting points, privacy regulations being secured, end-to-end traceability so that you can see which users did what, and of course the customer, usually the library or the information manager who has purchased all this information, shouldn't get a lot more administrative work. So it should really be easy for all stakeholders involved. And all stakeholders involved was another key principle that we listed, because it is very clear that there's a whole chain of parties in an access and authentication process. And if we don't solve it all together, it will never work. This cannot come from one side. We have to have a lot of people. So in a very early stage, we teamed up with NISO in the US, the Information Standards Organization in North America, and we started workshops like these and started to invite people from the library world, from vendors, from identity managing organizations, from federations like JISC and EduServe, and etc., etc. In the meanwhile, we have a steering community which represents all these stakeholders. We still have a few seats free, so people who feel urged, please make yourself known. You see the list here. And we have a program director, Julia Wallace, who, as I explained, unfortunately can't be here today. And we have Heather, whom you've already seen, who is our pilot project, I should say, pilot coordinator, right? Yes. Right. In what kind of direction are we seeking the solutions? You'll hear the word SAML a lot today. SAML has been used more in the corporate space than in the academic space so far, but offers a lot of possibilities to make a lot more possible in the academic space. Also has flexibility, can do a lot of things. I won't go into all those details because they'll be, you'll hear from them in each of the pilots, because each of the pilots takes a certain aspect to test. But I would like to zoom in a little bit on federated identity and privacy, because in the very early discussions it became clear that privacy is going to be one of the sensitive issues, and it doesn't need a lot of explanation why that is. You know, under IP address, people do not appear individually, whereas under if you move away from IP address, of course it will. So what you actually do with the data that you gather on individuals, and how do you organize their identity management? Well, that being such an important issue, it also means that one of the pilots is very much geared towards privacy, but the privacy aspect comes back in all of them. What is the aim of our project? This project does not build a new solution. This project does not create a new platform that will handle all the access and authentication everywhere. That is definitely not the ambition. The ambition of this project is to develop best practice and to set standards for best practice, to broadcast recommendations for best practice, and to do that on the basis of real-life testing and from experience in the real world. And in that way, we want to find out what are the right ways and the wrong ways to promote federated identity. And so we want to do that on actual experience via real pilots. And so far, we have 3 pilots listed. The pilot program will run throughout the rest of this year, again with a broad spectrum of stakeholders, looking at certain use cases, includes academic and corporate efforts. We want the pilots to be self-organized, because that is also the whole idea behind this project. You know, we're not offering a centralized solution. We want people to seek their own solution, but we want to create the umbrella which makes the information exchange possible and which gives you some guiding handholds on best practices. So the pilots will be self-organized, but tracked under the larger umbrella of RA21. The ultimate goals, again, move away from IP authentication, balance in the right way with the concept of privacy, and of course the GDPR is there the most notable thing, because that will be in force as of 2018, and create a set of best practice recommendations for identity discovery. We'll be having 3 pilots who address the problem from different angles, and again, we're not building something ourselves, and everything that is developed under the pilots will be openly shared with everybody. So that's another important principle. Okay, the floor will be open for more explanation on each of the pilots. We have a corporate pilot that will be presented by Helen Malone of JISC Pharma Company. We have 2 academic pilots. The first one, you see the word privacy is very prominent there. It's the P3W, Privacy Preserving Persistent Wave Pilot. It's very good to, if you have maybe a stutter problem or something like that. This is a really good exercise. And then we have the it will be Chris Shillem presenting that one. And we have the Wave Cloud Pilot, and that will be presented by you, Melton. Is that correct? Yeah. Okay. And combined in all these pilots is a sort of a central UX testing phase to have a user experience that is similar throughout, because that is also one of the guiding principles. Users don't like to be confronted again and again with a pop-up screen that is completely different from what they're used to. So we're building on the idea of a generic user interface. So I think that brings me to the end of the introduction. I think we're moving on immediately, because we also have at least as many people online as we have here in the room. And Helen, may I invite you to the floor? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. I'm so pleased to have been given the opportunity today to give you a quick update on the corporate pilot. My name's Helen Malone, and I'm the director of the Global Information Hub at GlaxoSmithKline, which is a large pharmaceutical company based in the UK. So today I'm representing both GSK and also the other pharma companies who are involved in the corporate pilot. So as we heard earlier, IP authentication has been a fantastically successful way of getting quick and easy access to the publisher content that we subscribe to. But we think there are 2 main reasons why we need to move beyond IP. The first of these is to respond to internal company restructuring. So that includes things like mergers and acquisitions and divestments. And IP authentication is really not flexible enough to enable us to do that. And the second driver is that we really have very high expectations from our users, and our users now expect to be able to access the content that we subscribe to off the network, where they don't necessarily have corporate access, on any device and from any workflow. And currently, the alternatives to IP outside the corporate network really are quite painful and long-winded, as illustrated by EFCA earlier, particularly actually if you're starting at a publisher website. So you can see on here, on this cycle, there's really two main obstacles to getting to that. So you either have to remember a specific site password, or you have to battle through a long list of choices in order to find your institution. And this really does cause immense frustration for our users. So we need to find a better way of getting to that content outside the corporate network, so it's as seamless as it is from within it. So the objectives for our corporate pilot are focusing on three things. The first of these is to improve the user experience at the publisher website. The second is to look at ways of capturing granular usage statistics, which is very important for us to be able to run our various services, and also to consider options for easy flow between publishers. So in the spirit of collaboration, there's a number of companies and 4 publishers involved in our corporate pilot. So we actually have 5 pharma companies and 4 publishers who are listed on this slide. And so we've made some great progress in our pilot that we started earlier this year. So the first of these is the publishers themselves have made some great progress in producing a new user experience flow, and we're about to test that with our users, and I believe we're going to hear a little bit more about that in the next section later this morning. We've also agreed requirements for granular usage statistics as well, and so we'll be looking to move that forward in the second half of the year. And then we've also started to explore a pharma federation for easy flow between publishers. Now, federations are very well known within the academic community, but they're really not something that we generally have within the corporate sector. And we've done some testing earlier this year where we used SAML single sign-on authentication, which was direct with each of the publishers and each of the pharma companies. We felt that that really wasn't scalable. So we really want to look at ways of seeing whether we can make that much more consistent and much easier to do. So I hope that gives you a quick summary of where we are with the corporate pilot. So I'm sure you'll agree that our scientists need us really to work together to make sure that we can have access outside the corporate network as easily as we can within it. And I'm very optimistic about how the progress of the corporate pilot, and I'm very pleased with the progress we've made so far, and feel that we're really getting much closer to making that a reality. So thank you very much. I'm happy to answer any questions later. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Next slide.
Turn off my email for a second.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Chris Shillam with Elsevier. Again, thanks very much for joining this morning on this beautiful Friday in London. I'm sure we'd all much rather be outside enjoying the weather, but instead we're here in this nice and cool meeting room, actually. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the P3W pilot. Apologies for the acronym, I came up with that, and it is a tongue twister, but I was trying to get to the point that there are 2 important things that we're trying to investigate in this pilot. First of all is how to, I think hopefully you've got the idea from the earlier discussions that the problem we're trying to solve is the identity provider discovery problem in federated authentication, right? But we believe that fundamentally, federated authentication, logging in with your home institution's credentials is the right way to solve the access problem, right? But I think many of us who've looked at this before know that the current user experience for identity provider discovery is horrible. You saw the screen flow that Efka walked through earlier on. And unless we solve that, we won't get users to understand what to do. We won't get adoption of federated authentication to provide access to these resources. So I think all of the pilots are getting at this UX problem in one way or the other. And hopefully we're going to not come up with 3 different UXs, but the folks involved across several of the pilots are the same. So we're going to develop and test some things that are common. The specific things we want to look at in this pilot are how to make sure that the identity provider discovery problem is persistent, right? So the idea is that we have a whole bunch of sites participating in this scheme, that if you select your identity provider in any of those, you don't have to do it in any of the others, right? They'll be able to determine who your identity provider is. That creates a privacy problem, right? That's fairly sensitive information. Who is this person on this computer or this device associated with? So that's where the privacy preserving aspect comes in. And the idea here is to use some local browser storage so that the only place that knows where your identity provider is your local browser, right? And that there is a mechanism that all of the participating sites can use to get at that information. So we had originally set up 2 kind of different pilots looking at the same aspect. One had some UX people but no technology folks. Another had some technology folks but not a lot of UX experience. So the last workshop we had on RA21 in Washington a few months ago, we decided Leif Johansson was proposing the academic pilot with the technology. I was proposing the UX pilot to join forces. So we have now a great set of folks collaborating on this project with project management from Géant, who in the academic space, the kind of folks who, the community of federation operators around the globe. We have a number of folks from community, SUNET, EduGain, EduServe, have a couple of publishers, certainly happy to have more join, and a number of universities. You'll see that all of the universities are in the States so far. So again, one of the reasons we really wanted to have a session in the UK, and I think we'll hopefully be doing another session in Europe in a few months' time, is to start to get the word out outside of the US about what we're trying to do here and get some broader participation. And a number of vendors, ProQuest, LibSync, EBSCO, and Ping. So really quickly, this is an incredibly lo-fi set of screens that I drew, so don't take any notice of the detail. And I think for the folks in the room in the next session, we'll be going through in a lot more detail a prototype that's had some more time and thought gone into it. But the idea here is to bootstrap the identity provider discovery problem with an email address, institutional email address. That's the first privacy problem, right? Because people giving their email addresses, that's personal information. We only really need the domain part of the email address to figure out where your ID provider is. So one of the UX challenges is to figure out a way of having the user enter their email domain in a way that they'll understand, and making sure that it's clear that we're not retaining that information, we're just going to use it to get to the next step. But the first time you go through this process, the idea is you'd use your institutional email address to bootstrap the choice of ID provider. That means we need to make sure there's enough information in the discovery service to map from ID provider from email domain to ID provider. That's where SUNET's experience with their shared discovery problem service comes into place, and they've already done a lot of that work. From that, obviously, you go to the institutional sign-on page. I may be being a bit optimistic in showing this in a small window. I don't know how many of these sign-on pages are mobile compliant. But one way or the other, you get to that screen, and then you get to the article, which already is a lot less steps than we saw in the current experience this morning. The persistence piece comes in here, where the second time you went through this flow. And this wouldn't just be on the same publisher's website. This would be on any participating publisher's website. Publisher would put some JavaScript on their page, which would be served from a common domain. But what that JavaScript would do would be to pull the choice of ID provider out of browser local storage, not going to anywhere on the web that's storing it, and enable the user to directly choose that ID provider. If we're really feeling, confident and this is something we can test, we can all go with the kind of I'm feeling lucky approach of Google and take you straight to that sign-on page and give you a way to choose a different one. That's some stuff that we need to test. And then again, if you're already signed on to that ID provider because you've been using another service that uses the same ID provider in the same session, transparently you're going to be bounced through that ID provider, the SAML response will come back and you'll be directly on the article page. So the two aspects by which we're trying to preserve privacy here is to come up with a UI that makes it clear that we only want the domain part of the email address in order to map to the ID provider. As I say, there are some UX challenges there, but I think smart UX folks will come up with a solution to that, and to make sure the IDP provider preference is stored in browser local storage, so there's no big scary server on the web that has all of this information about users and their devices and choice of ID provider. As Aifka mentioned, we have a workshop this afternoon with some of the participants to really get into the details of how we're going to do this. We think there are 3 work streams broadly. One is integrating the shared discovery service, so we can do that email domain mapping. The second is implementing and studying the improved user flow that I just briefly walked through. And then the third will be using the mechanism I described to store the choice of ID provider in local browser storage, which again I think is something which is already working in the SUNET shared discovery service. So how would this look from the user perspective? I think I've kind of already said this, but the first step is the discovery service checks the browser's local store. And if the local store is empty, then the user chooses, can search for an institution essentially using their domain name. I think we'd also enable them to search for their institution's name as well. But I think we suspect most users will understand this more if we simply ask them for an email address or email domain. And from a publisher's perspective, what we really want to do is enable that discovery process to be deeply integrated into the publisher website, right? So it'll be a question of exposing suitable APIs to enable that website, that discovery service to be incorporated into whatever the publisher sign-in flow is. One of the things we're also trying to do is use some work, again, Leif and his team have been doing, to gather telemetry about which service providers work with which ID providers, so that the list of ID providers can be filtered to only ones that are known to work with the service provider. And from the library perspective, I mean, other than having a SAML IDP set up, which many institutions have, certainly in the UK with the UK Access Management Federation, shouldn't be anything other to do technically, but obviously there's a big user education process to explain to users that, hey, there's a new way to sign on and access these kinds of resources. So that's it from me. I think we're going to take questions at the end, so I'll hand over to Meltem Dinser, who's going to talk about the other academic pilots.
Hi everyone, I'm Meltem Dinser. I'm from Wiley. We're actually going to collaborate here, so if I can have Colleen Tinley, also from Wiley, and Elias Belafutis, did I say it right? From Adafon. They'll take it up from me. So this pilot is actually similar to the P3W one in concept. Implementation-wise, it's slightly different. So the purpose of this is to get as close to as possible to the IP authentication, because from the user experience perspective, we can't beat that because there's nothing there. Again, we're trying to eliminate the steps that users have to go through, go from 6 to 0 as much as possible. Support for remote access when people are not on the institutional networks, and to do it slightly differently than the other academic pilot with a shared cloud, implementing a shared cloud. What we're hoping to test out here actually is if we were to build a shared infrastructure, open source, sort of self-governing, could we still preserve the privacy? And how would that govern and how would that work? What would the data formats be? What is the necessary and sufficient information to pass around? And we would still use the cookies on the device as the mechanism to store the data. So the basic concept around this is that we form a group of people, build some shared infrastructure not owned by anybody. And that shared infrastructure holds a hashed key for each user. And that hash key gets mapped to, again, the minimum and sufficient information through the cookies on the user's device so that the publishers can pass around information about the users. So if I go from one institution site to another, I don't have to go repeat where I am, which institutions I belong to. My information gets carried away, and we get to as close as possible to the IP authentication as we can. So that's the idea we're going to test that. So I'll have Colleen take it over from here, and now Colleen is going to hand over to Elias.
So we're just going to look at a main use case, and one of the main use cases is handling situations of remote access. So we have Lisa, who's our college student. She's off at her local coffee shop, and she's trying to find information on the content, and she's found an article. She's visited other publisher sites who participate in the web in this scenario. So what we're able to do, because Lisa has been recognized by a publisher within the cloud environment, is to be able to come back and present Lisa with a quick, easy method for authenticating herself and being able to come in and pick her institution. Because it's stored in the Wave Cloud, every publisher who participates in the Wave Cloud project has the possibility of coming in and accessing sign-in information or details that Lisa has done with other publishers. We're not going to run through, there's a more detailed breakdown of this. So if you look in the slide deck afterwards, you'll see exactly step-by-step what's happening in the exchange of data with the individual's computer, where we're storing cookies, and what's getting stored on the cloud. I think two of the big things is the cloud's not storing a lot of data. And the cloud data that's being stored is tied to the fact that there's information being stored on Lisa's computer that allows that connection to be made. So those are some of the ways that we're trying to at least handle some of the issues of the privacy, because not everything is going to be on the cloud, and it's only going to be device dependent. So.
So I guess I want to go back to the previous slide.
Just back one slide?
Yeah. One or two, I don't know how many times.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we can argue that that the Wave Cloud is also persistent, and we argue that it is privacy preserving. So I think feedback from previous workshop is, you know, what is the difference between the pilots, and so I will try to talk about some things that might differentiate this pilot, at least from a perspective of the user. So first and foremost, this is not a sample discovery service, and this is not to say that sample discovery service is not a good thing, but the Wave Cloud isn't. And this has several aspects. First, it does support sample authentication, but it's not limited to sample authentication. So if a university or library has other system or other protocol to authenticate users for that library, the Wave Cloud can support it. Second is that there is no common third-party domain where every user from every publisher is redirected to in order to get the UI with the options which are stored in a user's browser. And this offers some unique advantages to build a good user experience. So the Wave Cloud can support the native look and feel of the publisher, not just the publisher branding, but really integrate the login options inside the publisher site. There's no hard dependency to any particular UI design, and it leaves the freedom for a publisher to use raw information that comes from the Wave Cloud to integrate in the various locations in a user's workflow that the user has to log in. Also, the suggestions which are presented from the information that comes from the Wave Cloud can be filtered by the publisher platform so that they're always valid for a given publisher, and not there's no case that we present options that the publisher will not support the authentication of the user. And last but not least, it allows, we have several publishers that have their own local login options, as I call them, like a user logging in with a Mendeley, for instance, or with another user identity system that the particular publisher supports. So hopefully, processing raw information allows mixing, the data to present a single login screen that includes data from for organizational login and the local options of the publisher. And I will show you some examples. Okay, so this is an example how we can take a user, the publisher context into account before we offer the user some suggestions. So there is a user here that, based on his history visiting different publishers, there is some information in the Wave Cloud that this user is a member in 3 universities. But if you take the publisher context into account, maybe the first university will not provide access to a particular publication to that user because it doesn't have a license for that publication. The second university is not at all supported by this publisher. The third one is supported and provides access. But besides the information stored in the Wave Cloud, this publisher knows this user also locally as with his name, right, with his local account. So all this information can be processed by the publisher platform, and the list of options presented at the end is only those that are valid for the publisher and for the content that the user tries to access. I think there are some slides missing here from, but maybe the final date will include them. And a few words about privacy preserving and, of course, GDPR compliance. So what applies for the Wave Cloud, and I think for other methods, no matter where we store the data, is first user consent. In any of the solutions presented here, we have information about user belonging to an institution or to a university. And this is considered personal user data for GDPR, let's say. So no matter if we store it, no matter where we store the data, all these GDPR requirements apply. So user consent is a requirement, and with the Wave Cloud, we take this into account, and we make it easy for the user to give or withdraw consent at any time. Second important GDPR requirement is the right to access, meaning the user being able to view what data is stored for them. Right to erasure, to delete the data, and for these 2 requirements, the Wave Cloud provides a user-friendly graphical user interface that the user can see what data is stored for them there, what are the universities that they belong to, and they can delete any data if they want, they can see them, or they can withdraw their consent. There is another important aspect for GDPR compliance, which is pseudo-anonymization or minimization of data, so not stored data which are not needed, and if possible, to anonymize the data, and that's what we actually do. I have a slide for this to talk about. And last is about data breach. So another thing that separates the Wave Cloud from the previous pilot is that it stores all the data in a central server, and that includes a risk of a data breach. So what happens if someone steals this data, which is massive data, from a large number of users, and what does this mean for user privacy? And facts are that the data that might be stolen by the Wave Cloud cannot be used to impersonate a user and get the hacker unauthorized access to content of the user. But most importantly, this data cannot be used to identify a real person, even if the stolen data are combined with data from elsewhere. I'll show you a slide how this can do. So for more information about privacy, we have a privacy FAQ on this website. This website also has more information about the project in general, but you may be interested to read more about privacy there. And these are the slides that were missing. So short break to switch again back to the user interface examples. So I argued that the data from the Wave Cloud can be used in many different places in a publisher website. This is an example. The first header from the publisher is how it looks like with IP authentication today. So when a user visits the site from within the IP address of their institution, they get access provided by my institution. If you see the same example without using IP authentication, but using the Wave Cloud, it's going to be sign in with your university. So in both cases, the publisher recognizes that this person comes from that university. With IP authentication, they just provide access. With the Wave Cloud, they ask the user to sign in. The difference between the two is that IP authentication requires the user to come from a particular location, whereas for the Wave Cloud, it doesn't. It works even outside the location of the university. And I think this is what we call as close to IP authentication as possible. Another example is the famous access denial page. So when a user tries to access an article, but they don't come from the IP or they are unknown, instead of asking the user to sign in, and go through all the steps that FK talked earlier, the system can offer the user the option to sign in with her university, so they don't have to look it up in a long list and so on. But also can give other options like add to cart or whatever options. Different publishers have different options for the user. So this method, of having raw data available to the publisher allows to build custom user interface for the access denial. The last is the example I already presented, so I will not talk about it. Okay. I had another slide about privacy, but that's okay. I just maybe can go through it to highlight that we use pseudo-anonymization as a technique, so that when a user is known as a publisher, maybe with an ID stored in a cookie, this information is not stored like that in the Wave Cloud. The data is hashed. And hashing is a one-direction action. So if you hash something, you cannot unhash it. So someone that steals data stored in the Wave Cloud may steal the hash of a user, and the association of this hash with a university, but that cannot be reverted and cannot be used to trace which user, which real person is this hash. And that's it. We lost. Yeah.
Okay. I think we've got some questions anyway. So should we So thanks everybody. That concludes the presentations we had. We do have a pretty comprehensive website, RA21.org, and we have a general community mailing list you can sign up for if you're interested. And if you're interested in participating, email either Julia or Heather. I think we've got about 15 minutes for questions from any of the presenters. I think we have some questions from the webinar, so if you want to take one from there.
I'm going to come up so that they can
Perfect.
hear what the question is. So a question from some of our remote participants is, this is from Chris Phillips at Canary in Canada. He says there's a mismatch in business needs, such as consent or the opacity of identifiers, and help me find my institution and remember my choice. So the question is, can one agree that these two items are separate and that a cookie that hints on IDP selection is a separate thing from consent? I think that's mostly a question for Elias.
Yeah, a cookie is a different thing than user consent if it's stored without the user's consent. So the idea, and maybe this was not shown in the slide, is that the user is asked to select in the user interface that they agree to be remembered across publishers. And when the user makes this selection explicitly, then we can store the information about user's consent, and then we can store also, whatever did it, like a cookie or anything that will provide the information to maintain data about this user belonging to an institution. I'm not sure if this answers. I hope this answers the question.
Would that be, is such a solution GDPR proof?
I think it is. GDPR talks about making easy and simple to the user to give the consent and to withdraw the consent afterwards. So it's not a single action. User gives consent, and then if they change their mind, they have no other option. So first is making very, very simple and describing simply what it means. Give the option, and then also give the user another option to withdraw their consent as easily as they give it at a later time if they want. And I think we make every attempt possible to make it easy for the user. Maybe it was not clearly shown in those screenshots in the slide, but these are essential requirements for the design of the Wave Cloud solution. And I think this also applies for all the solutions, right? Because user consent applies even if information is stored in the device in the form of a cookie, right? And withdrawing the consent there is also a requirement in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, I think if I understand the question, the point was that maybe a where are you from hint an IDP provider is not personal information and it doesn't need consent. I think certainly under even the EU cookie law, right, consent will be required to store any information. So probably doesn't apply in North America, but certainly in Europe, I think. And in any case, it's always good practice to get consent whenever you store any information and tell the user what you're doing. So I think it would make sense. Heather, do we have other questions on the WebEx? Oh, question in the room while we're waiting. Go ahead.
I'll stand up so maybe I'll be able to do it online. But I think the presentations are very interesting. I had a question on the Wave Cloud one. Seems very ambitious, but I have a concern about the example of multiple IDPs that you showed us. If you have a scenario where more than one IDP has access to that particular publisher, say you can access a journal whether at the University of Edinburgh or Glasgow, how would the user or how would the Wave Cloud choose which provider to use? Because I can imagine a problem with usage statistics there, where one institution is seeing dwindling statistics and the other one is potentially seeing the bump. You see what I mean? If one is always the preferred IDP, like in the Heather example you've shown, there was one suggested shown, but multiple IDPs on
Right.
Right. Impact on the institution.
Yes. Well,
Repeat the question.
yeah, I think the question is if a user here belongs to multiple universities, how do we deal with showing one university and if that affects the statistics for other universities, right? And my answer is that the wave cloud is a filter, is nothing more than a filter to the huge list of options which are available at the publisher. So the decision is still on the user, but the user, instead of showing all institutions, even those that don't provide access, even those that don't work with his publisher, they just show a reduced list. So it's just filtering. I mean, it's not, even from a visual statistic perspective, it's not different than what we have today, right? Because today you get a huge list of publishers, and you still have to select which publisher, a huge list of institutions, and you still have to select one out of the huge. With the wave cloud, the selection is still on the user, but the user makes a selection one instead of just a few, right? So I think this is just giving the user the option, as they do have it today, but with a small set of options, where today we have more. So I guess my answer is that the choice is still on the user, and it doesn't make much difference to the current situation.
I agree. I think that you have to put a pitfall in the situation with a header where you are suggesting one preferred option, like you had signed in the University of Glasgow, and a link below that says choose another account. So in that scenario, you probably need to avoid.
Yeah. If I could just comment on that, I mean, I don't think this is specific to any of these solutions, right? The problem of having multiple places by which you can access content is something that we experience today in our non-shared solutions, right? And today, speaking for Elsevier, we have this thing called a choice screen, where every time we can't figure it out, we ask the user. We know users really, really hate that, right? So one of the things we're debating internally is what do we do about that? And there's a trade-off between convenience for the user and, as you say, making sure we don't bias against any particular institution in collecting stats. Question at the front here.
Yeah, so
comment.
Maybe I'm kind of missing this step, but how would the wave cloud be capturing the fact that you use, because if we're using email as like an infrastructure, that somebody is the same person from the New York University of Pennsylvania. Yeah.
Well, again, I don't think this is specific to the wave cloud, right? In any of the solutions, you can potentially use multiple IDPs, right? So part of the UI design question we'll have to look at is what do we do about that, right? So, I think Elias had some slides on that, but also in the P3W example, we're anticipating that if you've at some point, logged on with different IDPs, then you're going to see a list of more than one to choose from here and decide which one you want. And there'll probably be a box saying, remember this choice and use it last time, right?
There'd be like three options there.
Again, the whole point of testing these UIs is to see what makes sense for the user, but potentially. Other questions in the room? Gentleman at the back, I think I saw first.
What information exactly is stored in the local browser? Can it be pre-populated by institutions that labs and machines use to go to any set in the first place?
It's a great question for Leif.
Chris, can you?
And secondly,
okay.
Sharing information between IDPs, but when investigators,
yeah.
However, an IDP chooses to release certain attributes to particular users for the service they're logging into, and you can't have a mechanism by which some of that information can be used to third-party service information.
Okay, so I'll try and repeat the question, and then maybe Leif, you could come up so people could hear your answer on the microphone. The first question was, and now I've lost it. The first question was exactly what information would be stored in persistent local storage in the P3W example. And the second question is, if the user's using multiple IDPs, is there any way in which attributes released by one IDP could be mixed up with attributes released by other IDPs? Was that what you were getting at? Okay, and that was the question for the wave cloud. So in the wave cloud example, would it be possible for attributes to be released by one IDP to be accessed by another IDP? So let's take the P3W one first. Okay.
So the answer to that question is we're basically storing entity ID or identifier of the IDP plus cached information basically representing the MDUI stuff in metadata. So like things like logos. What you need to build that UI on the screen, right? And yes, there are ways we can on modern browsers have the IDP collaborating IDPs signal sort of their willingness to authenticate a user back to their device. Right? So they could pre-populate this information, right? Which means that a user from again a collaborating IDP would never have to see a selection UI.
Unless, Elias, can you tackle the second one?
So we haven't thought about pre-populating data in the web cloud. It's supposed to be self-learning. So first time a user have to go through the hassle to select it from a long list or search it or put the domain, whatever the publisher decides, and then it goes in. And after this goes in for one publisher, it becomes available if the user visits other publishers. So that's the day. But the data, it's pretty much the same. What we need to build pretty much a single UI, which is the federation ID and the entity ID, as well as a hash that represents a user.
Do we have other questions on the webinar?
We do. This is from Paul Axelson at SUNET. Hi, Paul. Paul says, if the usage of a publisher's information is vital to the end user's work, can you ask for consent due to, quote, consent should be given by a clear affirmative act establishing a freely given, specific, informed, and unambiguous indication of the data's subject agreement to the processing of personal data related to him or her. I suspect that's legal text.
So I'm not sure we've got, at least in the PPW pilot, far enough down the line to figure out how we'll... Whoops. Okay.
Sorry.
Dramatic event in the room there, but no harm done.
Tell people at home are still alive.
Yeah. I don't think... I don't think we got as far enough in figuring out exactly what we need to do in terms of consent screening to be exactly compliant with that wording, which I think comes from the GDPR. But obviously the answer is we'll need to figure that out, because if we can't figure that out, none of this will make sense. So it's a bit of a meta answer, but I think that's where we are right now. Question in the room?
It's kind of more of a comment than a question. I suspect some sort of thought of it. We just have to bear in mind that when whatever solution we come up with, we're dealing with local storage, we need some mechanisms to detect abuse. What we don't, because the question already came up from I made about sort of repopulating it, and that's great for making it easy for people to access. But what you don't want is somebody to post a link to the local storage file on Twitter and say, hey, copy this into this folder on your machine, you can access
Sure.
this for free.
Sure.
How we go about detecting that abuse and stopping it, that's another question together, but we just need to keep that in the back of our mind.
So let me just repeat that for the webinar. So the comment was in the local storage mechanism, particularly with mechanisms for pre-population, we need to make sure that there's a way of preventing abuse and use of bad links to get bad data into that local storage, which I think is a very good point, and definitely something we need to look at. Exactly. Yeah. Question at the back or comment?
So I'm pointing that I'm turning actually to a question, which is for any of these systems that we're talking about today, have you had an independent ethical hacker or maybe some not too ethical hackers test this and say, that's great, or maybe you need to fix some of the stuff?
Sure. So the question for the webinar was, have any of the pilots so far engaged an ethical hacker to test the security and potential privacy breach? So to be clear, we're all relatively early in the stages of developing these pilots. So these are not polished solutions. That sounds like an interesting idea. And hey, if you know some ethical hackers or are one yourself, then dive in, get involved. This is only going to happen through collaboration and participation.
What I always do a term time today, on Saturday morning after the fire. I'm on the stop at part of the time.
Yeah.
You want some students and some Saturday morning. Blast, I'm sure.
Great.
But it does tie in with the Wave Cloud. One of the things we're looking for is to set up a group that can help look at some of the security issues, possibly
Elaine,
tied to IT.
Hopefully they heard that. Okay, great. Comment or question at the back?
First presentation regarding data and the metadata. Not sure what we've studying activity phase. Wanted to see in common that more best practices for collecting metadata. The question about IP hints and domain name, framework, etc. That several federations are well have information. It's not common, so it might be good for the new framework sites, data sites can actually agree to, similar to the Dell Cocoa 1 and the 75. And the second one is...
Can I take one at a time, because otherwise I've got to repeat it for the webinar, right? Okay, so the comment was that there are several groups already looking at standards for inclusion of metadata for hints, and wasn't quite, are you suggesting we should work with those groups, or maybe suggesting we should work with those groups, which seems like a fantastic suggestion. Heather says we are already, so even better.
And similar to what the logo, one of the things looking at best practices data to make sure actually every site actually has some user interface data.
Yeah. Yeah. Comment about standardization of metadata for logos. So that all sounds like a good thing we should be doing. Back on the right.
Following up on that, there are standards already for all the make it new looking. So
okay, so the comment was there are already standards for populating a lot of these hints, and actually Leif has assured me that that's the case, although we're actually looking, again, internally at the metadata we get from different federations, and we're not seeing a huge amount of standardization there. So it may be a question of making sure the federation is actually following those standards rather than having to change the standards.
yeah, I don't think there is not following standards.
Okay. Sure. Sure. So not participating in making use of the standards maybe is more accurate. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
How would access be terminated when someone left an institution and they should no longer have access across the suggested solutions?
Yeah, so the question was how would access be terminated when somebody's left the institution? Anybody particularly fancy tackling that? If not, I'll have a go. I'm seeing blank faces. So it depends whether you want to kind of remember that piece of information that the user signed in, right? The base case is the user signs in every time they visit a participating site, and if they've left the institution, they won't be able to sign in because they are, signing into their institution, and they're going to be removed from the directory, presumably when they leave. Again, in kind of some of our internal work, we're suggesting that we might want to offer customers the ability to link an institutional account with, say, a social ID provider, and then only have to revalidate that link periodically. But the base case is, when a session's terminated, and the user has to sign in, if they've left the institution, they won't be able to sign in anymore.
I'm thinking with the Wave Cloud, if there's a hash stored in the cloud, would an institution be able to delete a particular hash when someone's accessed
the hash only tells you where the ID provider is. It doesn't. It's not an authentication token. It's an ID provider hint. Yeah. So you still would go back to the ID provider to log in.
So the user gets a suggestion, but when they click on the suggestion, they're redirected to their university, but they cannot log in anymore because they're removed from there. Yeah. And if the user doesn't want this to be remembered any longer, they can remove it from the suggestions. So, it's not shown every time as an old suggestion or an old thing.
So I think we're out of time on the webinar. I've got that.
With that, we are out of time for this part of our show. Yeah. But just to let the remote users know, from here we go into the user experience component. And JISC graciously offered to let us just keep this particular stream open. So if people are also interested in a bit more on what's happening in the user experience space, just stay on the video and we will continue. Yes, slides will be available and the video will be available. They should be posted or linked to from the website next week.
Great. So in that case, there's one more question in the front. Let's take that while we're swapping slides.
Yeah, I just wanted to validate that I understand this correctly, which is that so if this hash is just telling me what institution I'm coming from, do I still, as a publisher, get to know that was a unique individual and track that over?
So that's if I can say that, that's a two-step thing, right? In both cases, either the P3W or the Wave Cloud are just telling us as publishers where to send the user to sign in, right? When the user signs in, then their IDP may or may not release an attribute, which is either an ID or a pseudo ID for the user, right? But that's again a separate kind of part of the process. Exactly. Yeah. Great. Any other questions while we're okay? Who's starting the next bit? Richard. So I kind of alluded to this in the earlier session. So we're going to kind of do a deep dive on some of the UX work which has been done in the context of the corporate pilot that Kelly talked about earlier on. And I think Richard Northover from Elsevier and Ralph Youngen from ACS are going to take us through this.
Hi everyone. Yeah, so I'll talk through this, and Ralph, if there's anything you want to say, just shout. Hi everyone. So Chris has just answered the question, which is where am I from? I'm from Elsevier, and my name's Richard. My name's Richard Northover. What I'm going to be touching on in these slides reiterates many of the questions that have been talked about, but it's not talking about the Wave Cloud type of ideas. It's more to do with answering this question for the very first time, which needs to happen in any case. And what we're trying to get hold of is some kind of simple, consistent design pattern which can be used between the different publishers so that anybody who needs to answer the question, where are you from, isn't presented with a different way of answering that question every single time. So here's a kind of overview. Don't worry about the small writing. It's the bigger picture that I'm emphasizing here. So this just, I'm going to talk through the steps between not having access and having access. Okay. So this first box is showing you arriving at a publisher and not having access. Okay. And the next thing that normally happens is that you indicate in some way that you would like to get some access. And the next step is to say, okay, well, if you want to get some access, you're going to need to tell us where you're from. Otherwise, we can't work out the answer to that question. So the next question is, where are you from? If you can tell us where you are from, then we will send you to where you are from, which is your identity provider, which is either a university or a company or whatever, and that's where you know how to sign in. That's the important part, where you enter your actual credentials. And then, lo and behold, you have access. That's the simplest first-time journey. Okay? The ideal next step from that, not including the Wave Cloud sort of cross-publisher model, is for you to come back to the beginning of this and for you to have no access, but for there to be some existing hint about the answer to where are you from, which would just be sitting on your browser between you and that particular publisher. So what this is meant to say is, you know, I already know where you think you're from, or I have some hint about where you're from. You still have to prove that that's where you're from by going to the IDP. So it's not becoming less secure on that basis. But in an ideal world, if you're already signed into your IDP because you're using your university's intranet or whatever, then you go straight to access in one move. And depending on how transparent you want to be, how cautious you want to be in the UI, you've actually got something which is very similar to IP access there, because it just works first time for any given device. Okay? That is what happens if you try to display an emoji from a Mac on a PC. But it's a thumbs up. That's a good thing. So the bit that we're talking about here is this first point here. So when a user goes somewhere and doesn't have access and needs to answer the question, where are you from? Okay? There's another point which is not central to all of the different scenarios, but it's an important one, which is whether or not during this process you are individually identified. Because you could just get access and be anonymous, which is what the IP model does, right? You know, you're going in. We don't care who you are. We just want to know where you're from. With this Samuel Shibboleth model, in some cases, particularly the corporate cases, it's fundamental to both sides that we know who you are as well as where you're from. But there are other cases where it's from the point of view of a user's personalization and other types of features, that question comes in as well. So I'll touch on that in just a second. Okay, so I'm going to walk through an example of that high-level flow, and what I'm showing you is the outcome of a number of conversations which are ongoing, and what we want to do is show a generic user experience to some real people and get their feedback on it. This hasn't happened yet. We haven't shown it to the real people yet, so you're some real people who are going to see it for the first time. So here is a generic publisher, okay? And this generic publisher is showing a generic paper about something. And you don't have access. You've got the abstract, but you don't have anything else. And what we're showing here is a reasonable guess at the design pattern for how you indicate that you would like to get access. And that's this check access button here. That's the design pattern that we use at Elsevier, and I think it's probably used in a number of other places as well. It doesn't say get access, because you're not necessarily going to get access. You're going to check whether or not you can get access.
Sorry to interrupt. Kids at home can't see the slides, so I'm just going to reselect it. Particularly since this is about UX, and I think it'd be really valuable for them.
It's kind of central. Does that mean they can only see my forehead?
No, just for some reason the starter slide.
Right.
And that's how we start.
Well, it's a good start.
Just checking that. Yeah.
Computers.
Slide up. Hopefully, that should be doing it.
Sorry, kids at home. Shall I keep talking? That's good. Okay. So this blue box here is just highlighting the fact that we're talking about you have to interact with this page in some way to say, hey, I'd actually like to find out if I can get access, please. So you press check access. Now, I want to emphasize that this is not a visual design that we are testing the intricate detail of. It's a generic one. Okay. So in some way or another, this is a screen that's saying, where are you from? And the important point that we're trying to test is one possible answer to the thing that Chris highlighted a moment ago, which is what different information can we use to answer the question, where are you from, for the very first time? We can't look in the cloud yet because you haven't told us the first time. Right? So one possibility is that you just type in the name of your institution, which is what often happens today. And there's this additional idea of if you type your institutional email address, then that's something that everybody knows quite straightforwardly, and it's immediately unique and immediately a fast answer to that question. But it's got some tricky privacy connotations, as we said. So let's say you just type in the name of your institution, because that's what you're happy doing. You type in something, and up comes University of Amsterdam, which, because I work for Elsevier, is often used as an example. And so I press sign in. And boom, here I am. I signed in at the University of Amsterdam. That's independent from this whole thing. We can't control all of the thousands of IDPs UX. So you sign in there, and when you come back, depending on what it was you were trying to do, you would just get access. Okay, so we're not testing that bit, although I'll touch again on it in a second. But you have now, for all intents and purposes, achieved the same level of proof as you had if it was IP. So now you're getting access. Let's go back to that check access screen. We're not testing here whether it's called the check access screen, but that's a suggestion. We'll see what these words mean to people. This time, I'm going to type my email address into this box. This box, incidentally, is a little bit like the Google, and it's actually a design pattern that's used in lots of browsers now. But I think I'm right in saying that Chrome started it. this idea of being able to have the address bar at the top of the browser respond to either a search or a URL. They call it the omnibox. And so if you type either of those things, as you start typing, it goes, oh, that looks like a URL, so here's the URL, I'll just go straight to it. But if you type in just a random string, it'll do it as a search. So similarly, if we play around with some careful examination of what the user's typing, we can make an educated guess about whether they're typing an email or the name of an institution. So that's what I'm pointing at here. The important point is to somehow make sure that the user isn't deterred from entering their email address because they think, well, hold on, if you take my email address, you're going to register me in some way. You're going to take more, give an inch, take a mile, which is one of the reasons for this omnibox model. Because if you really feel strongly about that and you don't trust this interface yet, just enter the name of the institution and there's no exposure there. If it later turns out that we do need to know who you are as an individual, we can say, well, it's all very well us knowing where you're from, now we really do need to know where you're from. See what I mean? So it's it's not forcing a user to reveal themselves until they realize that that's actually what they need. So I type in my email address, and as has been mentioned before, the only bit that we're really interested in at this point is the domain, which is unique to the IDP. So here we can say, right, well, here's your IDP, why don't you sign in? You could skip this page if you really wanted to. And I'm back at the IDP again, and I sign in like I did before. And now I have the all-important download whole PDF button because I've got the access, which is what happened with the previous flow as well. And additionally, something standardized, again, saying access, you've got access now, and it's provided by the IDP that you just signed in. So that's the most important part of this flow that we're talking about, asking a user to answer the question, where are you from, in a couple of different possible ways. There's another important point, which is particularly important for the corporate use case, and as I said, it's sort of, from the point of view of a publisher, we have to support use cases of a whole different, a range of use cases where a user either has to be individually identified or institutionally proven to have an identity, or both. So you have to kind of not force down one route or another, which is one of the particular challenges. So here we've got a sign-in button as well as, so you're anonymously given access at this point. And if you want to reveal your identity as an individual as well, this is another option. In that case, if I went back to the IDP, in the previous flow, I sign in here. Let's imagine that this was a situation where I needed to be individually identified, or it was viable to ask if you wanted to be individually identified because the IDP maybe provides an individual identifier. At this point, you can insert a step saying, it would be great if you told us who you are as well as where you're from, and you would enter your email address afresh. Or maybe it came from the IDP as one of the pieces of data that came from the IDP, and that's just dependent on the privacy arrangements that you as a member of that institution already have. Possibly, okay, so there I put in my email address because I'm now identifying myself properly. Maybe this is a situation where it's optional that you identify yourself individually, in which case you could skip this step. If you're trying to use a product in the sphere of the publisher that requires to know who you are because it's a personalized thing like Mendeley or something like that, then you obviously can't skip this step because there's no point in signing in if you are not known as an individual. And similarly, if you're coming from Glaxo or from one of the other corporate companies, that corporate customers of publishers, where the arrangement is very important to know which parts of which company department are doing this action, then you obviously also can't skip this step. And here, in this case, I'm back at the same thing. I can still do the download, but I'm in some way individually identified. That's supposed to indicate that point. So we're going to be testing this interface with some real people. And what we've done, and this is a demo version of that survey, is walk them through this exact same flow that I just walked you through, asking them how much they do this in their life. And then showing it to them and tracking what they do. So maybe some of them will click check access and some of them will try to sign in. Let's see. They're presented with this screen, and it's saying, assume you typed in one of these options. Now, how do you feel about that? Do you think that you'd prefer to use institution name, or how do you feel about entering your email address at this point? Or are you pretty neutral? And what's your thinking at this point? So there you are, click login. And now, what do you think of this? Would you, then there's this related question about identifying yourself as an individual. How do you feel about that? There are consequences on both sides to remaining anonymous, to do with your ability to do this from other devices more straightforwardly in future and so on. So there's other questions being asked to get an opinion on those things. So that's it, and that's where we're up to. We're looking to send that survey to a whole range of people. I'm not actually sure at what point that's due to happen and who those people are. But opening up to any questions directed at me or anyone else.
Remember to repeat that.
Sure thing.
Sure.
Hey.
So I'm Matthias Byrne coming from ProQuest. So we're more on the academic side. We actually ran a usability study very similar for Where Are You From in kind of advance of this interview. So it'd be great to just kind of chat after. I'll show you what we came back with from our usability study. I think we talked to 11 participants, so 5 in the US and 6 outside. So we can probably share notes afterwards.
Excellent. For those on the call, that was just an offer to share some information that's based on a similar usability study. And I guess if anything comes of that, then we can share more widely. Any more? Any more? Sometimes no questions is a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing.
Give the kids 20 seconds though.
Yeah. There is that 20-second delay for
Well, I have a very general question while we wait.
Yes.
You're testing one option. Have you thought of testing a few alternative options at the same time in parallel?
I think when in the run-up. Sorry. So the question was, we have one option here. Do we have an intention to test multiple options in parallel? At the moment, I think because it's the initial outing of this interface, the idea is just to get some generic feedback and see what people think of it. If we feel strongly that there are multiple possible options on the back of that, because maybe the feedback was split into 2 camps, then we could do another iteration where we present 2 different options. I think the feeling among the group of people who were talking through this was that it's a good idea to start with one thing and just float the concept. I don't think there was multiple competing possible ideas that we wanted to test. I think that's fair to say at this point. But if there was, 2 different ideas, then we would certainly, I guess, do the same thing, but just some form of A/B test or something along those lines. Is there anything else to say there, Ralph?
No, I think that's right. If anyone is aware of a different usage pattern, to accomplish the user experience that we're trying to solve here, please let us know, because to Richard's point here, we don't have a next best option, to try to test. This is the option that we're looking to test at this point.
Well, this is a question from my study. There is in the metadata some discovery hints where potentially, I know it's not very well populated today, but we have IPs from institutions, we have domain names as well. Especially the IP part is an easy one that maybe could be used to discover institutions that belong. So we may not always have to ask for the name of the institution or the email address. You already pick up the IP as part of that institution.
So this is a point that's being made, just saying that from all of the different IDPs, there's a whole range of different metadata attributes which are not universal across all the IDPs, but they include hints like geolocation or IP range, ironically, which can be used to help to answer this question in other ways. If you're coming for the first time, so there is nothing sitting in the privacy-preserving wave cloud, and there's nothing else apart from to ask you a question, are there any other things we could do? We could say, well, it looks like you're in this range, so we could send you to your IDP on that basis. But if you're sitting in Heathrow Airport waiting to go to a conference, that's not much help, and ditto for all these other mobile use cases. So you might end up with a user interface that says, looks like you're from the University of Starbucks. It's like, well, actually, I'm not. So, but absolutely right. There are lots and lots of hints that we might be able to make use of.
I actually think it might be useful to do a bit of anti-pattern research. So there are a lot of these things that have been proposed, and they keep getting proposed, right? And the geolocation, for instance, right? There is experience in the RD community to suggest that is actually a bad idea because of what you said. Right? Mobility sort of makes this a bad idea. But it would be nice if you guys could actually demonstrate that once and for all. I mean, so at the P3W call, we had this guy, I can't remember who turned up and say we've got data to suggest that less than 10% of users actually do that. Right? It would actually be good to document these things once and for all because we'd like to get past this. Right?
So the point is that it would be good to be able to eliminate with evidence some of the other suggestions that are being made. I mean, I guess gathering evidence is one thing, but forcefully pointing out facts is also another way of doing it, which is not everybody is sitting in the physical location of their IDP, which is the whole point of computers.
Documenting the data empirically or just reasoning, whatever, right? For both. But it might be good to document satellite patterns too, not just finding the good solution, because the other ones will come back to one.
Yeah, I guess there's principles in the RA21 document, but there's probably some kind of secondary principles, which are axioms. We take the following things to be self-evident. Not everybody is sitting in their library. Not everybody is in the geolocation of their library. In fact, they may be on the other side of the world. Move on. Are there any? I'll just see if there's any questions on the computer. No. Is that because they can't hear us?
No, I'm chatting with Julie actually, so I have a comment for you, but I'll hold that one.
Another question.
Can you just explain? You said you're only caring about the ground, so using the omnibox might be worth putting a little bit of text there for you to say we only care about your ground, just to highlight it. And when they're typing the omnibox, it's going to be like an character. Make sure everything left of that is light text.
Yeah.
Because that will give the action that you are a Smith.
Yes. That was in Chris's. Yep. So repeating the question for those on the line, is there a way with the Omnibox design where we're asking for an email address to use to work out where you're from? Would it be a good idea to emphasize the point that the only bit that you're really interested in is the bit after the @ symbol? And there's probably lots of different ways to do that. I think our current thinking is just to see what happens if you just ask for it in the most simple way. And then we can go into some more intricate solutions. You'd have to build some pretty clever JavaScript and test that in order to do the test at all. So I think we're just trying to take it step by step.
Certainly, in terms of the UK Federation, one of our axioms is probably like do no harm.
Yeah.
And we're certainly very aware that the user community, the end user community, needs to be educated, and how to behave online. And my concern is that you're putting a degree of burden on the end user to understand this, not just on the actually when they're there, but conceptually when they're doing something else. And we don't want to make them vulnerable to phishing sites. And we might be behaving perfectly, but we also need to engender behavior which doesn't leave them vulnerable in another situation.
Yeah, so don't ever give your email address even to someone who says, hey, trust me, I'm not going to use your email address because that is an anti-pattern.
And I think that's sort of, I was going to put it a little bit more bluntly, that you actually need the collaboration of both
the publishers but also the IDPs. They're also going to have to get them to collaborate. And almost all of the federation and IDP operators have this sort of, this is ingrained in the contract. That we're sort of guardians of user privacy and our community. So that thing that we're talking about may not matter one iota for users. I think they're going to be fine either way, right? They're going to give you whatever you ask them for. But it's going to matter a lot for getting buy-in from Fed and IDP.
So I'll try and summarize that for those on the line and who may not have heard. I think the point was that asking for email address in order to answer the question, where are you from, is a really difficult thing no matter how clever your UX, because fundamentally what you are doing is asking a user to tell a system their email address. And it's a cultural thing, and it's a trust thing, and it's a very difficult thing. So I think the first step here is to propose something which doesn't insist on email address, and therefore we can reveal we can take the temperature of that question, and we can also illustrate how much we can be trusted to ask for something and not make use of it. For example, by making it slightly more difficult for you to register by not storing it.
Yeah, I'm certainly less concerned about it being used responsibly by this community. It's just the sense of leaving people open to phishing.
It's a design.
One of the problems is, as I understand it, one of the ideas behind the RA21 is to, improve security, reduce piracy, etc. Whereas this almost opens a loophole where you change behaviour, people are going to fall for that.
Well, I think I'll stand and just make a comment. End users are quite happy to give us their email addresses, right? They do this thousands of times a day, and they are quite used to the fact, hopefully, that they are on a publisher's website, they know what the domain is, they can see the little HTTPS checkbox, and they think, okay, I can put my email address in here. So we're not fundamentally changing anything other than what users do today already. But I think to Leif's point, it's really important as we design this to give the option of privacy preserving, so the user does not have to provide that email address if they don't want to move forward. And I think that's what the Omnibox design is trying to get to, and be completely transparent about what we're doing at any point in time, right? Which is, again, the point that if you're asking for an email address for IDP discovery versus asking for the email address for registration, be really, really clear about what you're doing and make sure the user, has the ability to understand that, right? But just saying we're never going to use email address because even though we know it would be a lot easier, or we guess it's going to be a lot easier for users to get through this process, it's just too difficult to work out the balance between usability and privacy. I think that's held us back for a long time, right? And we're left with this pretty horrible user experience today that we know users don't get through.
I think we need to understand the users a little bit more, and what they understand. And I think if we can do UX testing, like you said, if they see an HTTPS, they'll know it's okay. I'm wondering how many I know that would even be aware of it.
And there's an important point, which is that we have a very wide range of different types of people who are going to be using this interface. So if you ask one set of people, they might very well understand it. But the point is that interface has got to work for the other group of people, because until they answer the question, where are you from, we don't know.
Yeah,
so we can't tailor it.
Progress. We're talking about an awful lot of further education, community college users.
Maybe just along those same lines, because we have been discussing this for almost a year, and this comes up a lot. So to Chris's point, a lot of our users go to little game apps and give their email addresses and play games, and it's all out in the open. I think important thing to test also, I think, in user experience is all the scenarios. If you give your email address and register, this is the user experience you get, and these are the privacy answers that we give to you. If you give your email address just for the where are you from question, you're not logging in and registering. Because I think most people are used to logging in and registering with email address, not used to just give it as a piece of information. But then also have the user experience perfectly okay, consent, not comfortable with registering, not comfortable with sharing your email address. Here's the user experience. You get that because you have to go through 6 steps to drop down, and it's perfectly the user's choice. If you want to go that way, we'll support it. So we're not saying we're not supporting. I think that's important for the overall user experience.
Just my very last comeback. Again, just going back to the sort of do no harm rationale. But as a community, we can say, yeah, we'll take the risk on that. Obviously, users exposing email, there's gains, there's risks, and we'll take that on board. But if their credentials are getting phished, then suddenly that's, internal university systems, people, who aren't actually in this space right now. So it goes beyond saying, yeah, to publisher access resources, this is a pragmatic solution. And that might very well be true, but the problem is it will have implications on other groups who really aren't in this room.
Yeah, I mean, and that's always going to be the case, no matter what we do, so we have to just be aware of it. I was going to say one other thing on this point, very brief one, which is, do you remember my first slide that had the diagonal line going straight from the beginning to the end? Something that we haven't mentioned very much, which is the step between this first answering of the question, where are you from, and the other pilots to do with this information being available, shared in the cloud in some distributed way. There's an intermediate step which is local to one publisher and one browser, which is to remember the answer, where are you from, for next time, which means that no matter how you go about answering the question, you probably won't have to answer it ever again on that device for that publisher, which means that you only have to see this this tricky question once per device per publisher. There's 2 more. If with the caveat of consent and checkboxes and so on, always. There's a few other questions in the room.
Really
yeah. Sorry.
I actually, this is a friend. I actually think we can get away with doing this for not just for device to publisher, but device period. I think we can, based on the RNE community, we can probably get to a place in a few years where a lot of federations use the same infrastructure.
Right.
That means that for other services too, the likelihood that when you visit a publisher, it's going to be very likely that this is not going to be the first service that you visit. Which means that for a lot of users, they will never see this long-winded discovery flow for a publisher.
Or short discovery flow.
Yeah. That's not going to be their first exposure to discovery.
Yeah.
But that was apparently the other thing I was going to make, and that's sort of a suggestion for your UX work. I would be very, very curious to find out whether users actually understand what their mail address is, because a lot of them will have more than one.
Yeah.
And do they have? I mean, when you ask them, type in your email address, do they know which one they're supposed to type in?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're supposed to. I mean, I have like more than one institutional address, and they're forwarded in complex ways. I don't think I'm an outlier actually when it comes to that. A lot of high-end researchers will have multiple affiliations. They will have complex setups. They will have more than one private email address. What are they going to give you?
Should we find out?
Yeah, but I'd like to, it would be interesting, don't you think, to find out whether specifically they understand the concept of, what do you mean when I ask you for an email address? There's an implicit ask there, right?
There really is, yeah. And it's a really difficult question because if I ask you what your email address is, you're only going to tell me one.
Yeah.
But it's going to be fairly difficult to do anything about that in the user interface.
And when I type in gmail@gmail.com, what are you going to do?
Well, I can tell you the answer. I don't know if we've got time, but I mean, we've plenty of time. The point is that any email address is going to be able to tell the publisher something. It may well be, so at Elsevier, and I know at other publishers, there's lots of different ways, as well as Shibboleth, and aside from IP, to prove that you are who you say you are. One of them is to enter an email address, which is pre-registered, and then send them a magic link to prove that you have access to that inbox. Others include things like physical codes that you can get given on a piece of paper in your library. You redeem that code, and then you just register on the top of that with any email address, like a Gmail address, and then that account that you've created is blessed with that institutional association for some period of time. So at Elsevier, this interface, which we are currently experimenting with and building the first version of, will respond to any email address. If you give us an institutional one, and we go, that looks like one that we could use to send you to the IDP, and that's the right thing to do, we'll do that. If there's no IDP that matches that email address, maybe it can be used for another access type, like self-managed remote access, this magic email link thing, in which case we would do that. If it turns out that that email address corresponds to an existing account which has been blessed with magic access through some other mechanism, then we can use that. So there's it's like behind the scenes, there's lots and lots of hamsters running around trying to work out the best thing to do. And if nothing can be done with that email address, we can say, well, do you want to try your next best guess? And so the UX of that, as you point out, is really, really tricky. The next question in the room, please.
That's actually a beautiful segue into the possible suggestion I have. We're after where are you from?
Yep.
Now, anyone who's used some sign-on systems, including codes, QR codes, etc., why don't we just be able to enable a scanning of their logo of their institution? Which, if you've got these materials of paper, that's also got a little logo on it, we can scan it.
Yeah, I mean, so the question was, on the subject of finding quick ways to answer the question, where are you from, could we use things like QR codes? And there may be lots of other ones, because, I mean, as we all know, there's a myriad of different ways of proving that you are who you say you are, and I'm holding up my mobile phone, which knows who I am. One of the things that we can do, if we centralize interfaces within publishers, we can experiment with these things in ways that we can rapidly experiment with these things. So we'll get the basics in place, something like asking for the name of your institution, falling back on this potentially, controversial but also potentially extremely useful email address method, and then also you could say, right, well, are there other ways, including the metadata of the IDPs? Do you want to show us your iris, and so on? So. Yeah. Well, I don't see any problem with anything we've shown so far, but I think if the point you're making is that we should provide as many ways to go about answering the question where you're from, and also proving that you are who you say you are, as is, rationally possible, then absolutely I agree. Because if you stick with just one, and there's all these other possible ones out there, then we're missing a trick. So I think I agree. Happy to answer any further questions.
I think,
20 more minutes worth.
Yeah, so, I mean, we certainly don't have to stay in the room if we don't want to, but just in case there are any more general questions, not just for Richard, but for any of the presenters or any other discussed, let's just get a few minutes. There's one straight away there. Fantastic.
So I think they make an interesting point about working with the academic institutions and the academic part of this, because sometimes, I mean, we can create a beautiful interface to address the way from people, and then once the user actually lands on the IDP website and authenticate, sometimes there's multiple problems there. The interface is ugly, it breaks down, I don't know what my user, whatever my student ID, whatever the thing is. So I was wondering if there's anything we can do to try and alleviate some of that burden, standardize, whatever. So it's something we can do so that the user experience doesn't degrade as soon as you move off the cellular interface.
The devious part of my brain wants to suggest the universities delegate authentication to publishers. I think that's probably not what you want to do.
So I think, again, just to summarize for really patient people on the webinar, if they're still with us, the question was, or the comment was, what about the IDP user experience, right? What happens when you land at the experience? Is there work we can and should be doing in order to try and improve and maybe standardize those experiences. I think that's a fantastic point. One of the things which we mentioned in the earlier deck is that RA21 is a joint initiative between STM and NISO, the National Information Standards Organization in the US. And one of the things that NISO is working on with a number of US institutions is a grant proposal with the Mellon Foundation to get some funding to look at implementation on the institutional side, right? And I think that would encompass both things like training, enablement in an institution, and also potentially almost kind of best practices around UX on the IDP side as well. So that's on the US side. I don't know as well the landscape here in the UK and in Europe, but I think things like that would be fantastic to bring up under the RA21 umbrella.
All I'd say is relying on trying to standardize things is quite a challenge, because obviously REFEDS and NISO did look at a particular community to try to get a standardized response to this problem, and that community was the published community, and we found it very challenging. And I think the same would go for, you know, working with institutions on the IDP side.
Yeah, I mean, I think rather than standardization, the way I look at things is developing best practices, right? And best practices which are hopefully backed up by evidence, things like user tests, data, and then, you know, institutions can then make their own decisions as to whether those best practices are applicable to them. But I think that's more likely to get some traction than...
Yeah, I mean, that would certainly be NISO, REFEDS, espresso approach.
Yeah, yeah. Other questions, comments in the room? At the back.
Comments about the user experience. In the future, there'll be a case of them just going on to the on-site portal, clicking their user password and continue. There's also the consent release module that's coming into play, which has a whole load of tick boxes and options and so forth.
Yeah.
Certainly a couple of working people for that. User experience strong participation on that side of things too, to make sure that it's available.
Yeah.
And they understand if they don't allow something, at least why it's still, they never go back to working.
Yeah. So the comment was about the work that's been done on attribute release UIs, and the point that after the user has signed in at their home institution, potentially they're going to go through a screen which says, what stuff do you want this service provider to know? I think that's an excellent point. I don't know, I've talked to some of the folks who are doing that work. We haven't got them directly plugged into the pilots again. I mean, I think we have to be careful not to try and do everything at once, right? And I think that we're trying to solve this very, very specific problem of IDP discovery. Of course, there's other good work being done, and these things should all be aligned and built together.
I'll just say on that one, I mean, as we probably all know, there's parallel user experiences in the outside world to do with OAuth and those kinds of consent screens, which are fairly well established. And, you know, people vote with their feet in their billions, literally, to work out and use those. So there's stuff to draw on there.
Unfortunately, the experience a lot of users have, even before they reach the age where they'll start logging into the system nowadays with their iOS and Android apps, is when they install stuff, it asks for loads of permissions, and they confuse it, and then it doesn't install the well, that won't work.
I guess it's a common problem amongst a lot of different systems. At least it's not a unique problem.
And Chris gets to summarize that now.
Yeah. Great. So there's discussion in the room about other experiences users have of getting permissions. For example, in OAuth permission screens, those flows are fairly well established and used on the consumer web. And then the counter remark to that was, that's all well and good, but there are often experiences now where users are being asked to provide permission to things. They don't understand the implications of either providing or not providing the permission, and if they don't, then things just don't work for them, right? So there are definitely challenges there. Is that okay? Okay. Any other closing comments, questions? Nothing else on the webinar? Great. Well, thanks so much, everybody, for participating today.